Kyle Wickings. I'm the turf entomologist at Cornell, and I run the soil biology lab here. So my lab does a lot of work on beneficials and pests in turfgrass soils in the root zone of turf, and we're going to cover some of that tonight, pretty much through the lens, though, of neonicotinoids. And we're going to talk a lot about the new Birds and Bees Protection Act and talk about what it means for turf. This is a general overview of what we'll talk about. We'll start by just kind of defining neonicotinoids and putting them into context, what they are, kind of where did they come from, and why are they used in turfgrass, where are they used in turf. We'll go over in as much detail as I can provide the Birds and Bees Protection Act. We'll talk about what it is, when and how it's going to impact turfgrass managers, who specifically in the turf industry it'll affect. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the time giving an overview of the turf insect pests that we have that many of you are probably already very familiar with, but we'll talk about them sort of in the context of having neonicotinoids and not having neonicotinoids as a management option. I'll talk about some management gaps that I see on the horizon and some of the challenges that we'll face without neonics. And we're also, as Hillary said, going to have some poll questions. The last poll is one that I'm hoping we can generate some input from you all on management gaps that you see and some of the research needs you feel are out there, because we're trying to collect information on that everywhere. So yeah, let's get started. So we'll start just by talking about neonicotinoids in general. So they're synthetic insecticides that interfere with neurotransmitter receptors in insects. So essentially they impair insect nerve function. They're chemically related to nicotine. They are sort of built or derived from that as a model. And unlike nicotine, they're fairly selective to insects as well. So nicotine has high mammalian toxicity, but neonicotinoids do not. So that's one benefit that was touted about neonics when they were brought onto the market and being developed. And that was sort of a intentional goal of developing them, was to have that narrow selection around insects. So they are water soluble as well. And this is important in the fact that we use them systemically. So we apply them to soil, typically in turf grasses, drench them into either shallow in the soil or deep into the root zone for plant uptake through the roots. And that's an important part of their effectiveness that we need to sort of meet in making them work. But it also brings challenges, as we'll talk about in a little bit. So the first commercially available neonicotinoid was imidacloprid. But you can see on this slide here, there's a number of neonicotinoids that you'll see out there available, not necessarily in New York and not necessarily in turfgrass though. So there's actually just one that's available in New York for turfgrass that we see registered products for. So outside of New York, you will see some turf and landscape products with these other active ingredients. And just to back up, those active ingredients are imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, dinotefuran, clothianidin, and acetamiprid. There are some cases, I think, in landscape where acetamiprid is used, but for the most part, in New York, we're talking about imidacloprid when we're talking about these neonicotinoids. So it's pretty much that you need to be concerned about when we're talking about losing neonicotinoids in New York. So it's interesting to talk about neonics in sort of their development. When they came about, they were really seen as an IPM move or a maneuver, because they were meant to replace or help reduce the reliance on products like organophosphates and carbamates, which have high mammalian toxicity, a number of non-target effects, and can have some problematic impacts environmentally. So it was really seen as a beneficial IPM development. So we'll talk about how that's changed and sort of what happens when we lose neonics in that regard in a bit. So the main concerns about them, we're sort of touching on this already, include things like off-site movement, including leaching, runoff, and drift. And drift kind of comes about when we think about their use in ag, especially with seed treatments using dry powder formulations. This relates to also their effects on groundwater and surface water. It can lead to contamination in some cases because of their solubility and their ability to move. But they can also be quite persistent in the soil environment. They can bind to soil, they can bind to organic matter, and they also have a long half-life. So these are among the things that present some concern and have about neonicotinoids and their use. But perhaps the biggest one, and this is sort of reflected in the name of this act that we're going to talk about tonight, is their exposure to beneficials and effects on non-target organisms. And this has particularly been the case with a lot of interest around their impacts on pollinators. And there's been negative effects shown in the literature and research on pollinator behavior, development, and reproduction. There's other negative non-target impacts. This is some data that my lab has generated looking at soil invertebrates as well. There's been a lot more attention around the pollinators than soil invertebrates. but there's some there as well. And there's also some evidence that through their use systemically, as they move through the plant, some of these products can also be present in nectar of flowering plants. For example, in low input turf grasses that have flowering weeds, there's some evidence from Dan Potter's lab out of the University of Kentucky showing that it can be present in clover nectar and also in guttation droplets on turf grass itself. So plenty of concerns around the use of neonics that have contributed to where we're at today. So where we're at tonight is talking about the Birds and Bees Protection Act that was signed by Governor Hochul recently. So I have this link, I think you can all see it behind my screenshot here, but this QR code will take you to the Birds and Bees Protection Act if you want to read the document around it. It's very easy to track down if you Google it as well, but you can grab a snapshot of it here or watch the talk later to follow the QR code if you want to check it out. But we're going to go through some of the high points of it. I should mention that a lot of the focus of this document is around field crop agriculture. So, and a lot of the development of the language is around seed treatment of field crop seeds. So it's the application of neonicotinoids to corn, soybean, and wheat seeds that will be banned, I think, in the beginning of 2029. So, but in addition to that, there's some major impacts on the turf and ornamentals industry, as you probably all know, and that's what we're going to focus on from here on out. Just to show there's a lot broader context than just turf grass to this act. So, okay, so let's talk about its relevance for turf and ornamentals. What is it going to mean and what's it going to look like? So the first thing I want to point out is impacts on turf grass producers and also producers of ornamental crops. So this act is not impacting those folks. So if you're actually producing sod in the production, it's not removing neonicotinoids from use for that. But beyond that, if you are a licensed applicator and you're making applications to existing turf to maintain it or existing ornamentals to maintain them, neonicotinoids will no longer be allowed starting in December 31st, 2026. So that means the start of spring 27, when you're looking to do your next neonic application, they're not going to be allowed. So that's really when it's going to start, and it's really licensed applicators that will be affected by it. I bring that up because a lot of people ask about, well, what about homeowners? Do they have access to it? Are they going to be impacted by this as well? And I bring up in all these conversations always that neonicotinoids have already been removed from the realm of homeowner products. So they were reclassified last year as restricted use only, and that removed them from the homeowner market. Many homeowners don't know this. You'll go into your big box store, you'll see the same grub killer bag on the shelf with the grub with glowing red eyes. But if you look on the back, the active ingredient often has been changed from imidacloprid out to a new active ingredient. Chlorantraniliprole is a common one that we'll talk about in detail in a bit, as well as when you get down on Long Island, products like organophosphates have come back on the label. So that's already happened within the homeowner market. So we're really talking about licensed applicators when we talk about the Birds and Bees Protection Act here. If you do look at that document, you'll also see some language in turf and ornamentals about other active ingredients within the neonic group. Clothianidin and dinotefuran are going to be banned this coming December 2024. But currently there are already no turf products with clothianidin or dinotefuran in them now. So it's not, the only one we have in turf right now is imidacloprid. So just to give you a heads up on that, you'll see this point when you read through the act text. There are some potential provisions that are going to be put in place in cases of what's defined as environmental emergencies. I don't know the exact language around them, but I can say that I'm sure this bar is going to be quite high for what constitutes an environmental emergency, and I doubt it will be constituted by just a bad-looking lawn. So I think they're going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and there is specific language in the act around what will constitute an environmental emergency for review. One other point I want to make about this is that there will be an annual neonic use training course that's required during the time where you're still allowed to use neonicotinoids. It hasn't been developed yet. It's in process now. It's going to need to be DEC approved if you are going to take it. And it's something that I don't know where it's going to be built in and how it's going to look, if it'll be pinned to some of the recertification courses or the licensing process. But that's one additional thing that'll be present during the time that neonics are still allowed. One final point is that DEC and Department of Ag and Markets in New York have put together some research funds to support work on neonicotinoid alternatives. And this covers crops ranging from field crops fruits and vegetables, and also turfgrass. So my lab has some funds working on neonic alternatives in turf. And there's going to be a report that will be published in the beginning of January 2026 on all of our results. So just to give you all some high points of some of the work that we are doing in this area, and this is, I'm mentioning this now because as I said, I'm also interested in hearing your ideas at the end. But there's a couple different categories that we're working in. The first is looking at conventional insecticide alternatives, and that covers both preventative and curative type approaches and type products. But we're also looking at biological approaches. We're looking at biological control using insect pathogenic nematodes and fungi. We're hoping this season to look at some bio-based products like Bacillus thuringiensis. We now have a strain that works to target scarab larvae, and that's what we're going to explore this coming summer. And also we're looking at some biological interactions. So trying to see if we can get more consistent and better control with biological control organisms if we prime the soil with products like soil wetting agents. So those are the main areas that we're working in now regarding neonic alternatives. Okay, so this, Hillary, this is our first poll quiz. I don't know if you need to trigger something. But
yes, let me. So if I go to more and I go to polls and quizzes.
Do you want me to read it, Hillary?
Sure, and you should all be able to see it now.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is one, it's a true or false question. And it's a scenario. So homeowners can purchase and apply neonicotinoids until December 31st, 2026. True or false?
We're getting a lot of answers. We're about 40, 50%. Yeah, so if you, like I said, if you are here for either DEC or ISA questions, please make sure that you answer this poll. In order to get credits, I have to see that you answered all 3 polls. So if you're here for DEC or ISA credits, make sure that you signed in to the chat. So if you're here for that, sign in to the chat and please make sure you answer all 3 questions. So we'll give it another maybe 15 seconds and get anybody. Yeah, we got some more people coming in, and if you're having a problem at all, feel free to type into the chat if there's something not working for you. But let's give it another maybe 15 seconds. Everyone's still going. Okay, let's see. Oh, we got 73% of the participants have answered. And we will cut it off at 1.5 minutes. It's just not to spend too much time. Okay, so I will end the poll and I will share the results. Kyle, 96% said false.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so it was a trick question, I'll admit. So yeah, the answer is false. So homeowners already cannot use neonicotinoids. So they cannot use them until December 2026 because they've already been unable to use them for at least a year. So, and we'll bring this up again as we move through the talk. All right. All set, Hillary?
Good to go.
Great. Okay, so from here on, we're going to move into talking specifically about turfgrass insects. We're going to talk about their management, and I'll focus on their management in 2 scenarios, with neonicotinoids and without neonicotinoids. We'll talk about some of the challenges in each scenario. So we'll start with annual white grubs because I think this is probably the biggest one on everyone's mind because it's the one I think we're going to be impacted, that'll be impacted most, our management of annual white grubs. So first, we'll talk about white grub management using imidacloprid. And this is probably the most common thing that happens across all the different sectors of turf. And that is a preventative application of imidacloprid, our one primary neonicotinoid for turf against white grubs. So you'll see this come up a lot when I talk about preventative applications of insecticides, but that is trying to get these products into the system early enough that they can be taken up systemically. So we're trying to time these applications with peak activity of adults in the system. So this is, in this scenario, it's Japanese beetle. They're having mating swarms and feeding. In this case, they're feeding, and females burrow into the soil to lay eggs. So at that point where you have peak adult activity, that's the window where these preventative applications of imidacloprid go out. So they're moved to the root zone either through irrigation or precipitation, so they can be taken up systemically. And the aim is to, by the time eggs hatch, the product is already in the plant, so the new larvae can feed on it, and they'll be intercepted by the imidacloprid. So that's the most common thing. And you talk to people about what they do to manage grubs, they say they put out their grub application, and this is it. So it's something that we rely on pretty heavily within our practices now for the turf industry. Let's talk about pros and cons of it. Pros, I think, was one of the biggest ones, is that it's quite affordable. In some of the cheapest cases, it can be $25 to $30 an acre to apply. I've seen examples of it going up to near $100 an acre, but it's pretty common to do it at this level. It can provide potentially season-long control if it's put in the system at the right time, and it has adequate moisture and environmental traits to make it go systemic well. It also frees up, if things don't go so well in the beginning of the season, there is some time for the manager to come in and do somewhat of a rescue application against white grubs later on in the season. So it gives a lot of flexibility in its use. But one important trait, as I said, is its cost. Some of the cons that come along with it is some well-established above and below ground negative non-target effects that we've talked about already. Another thing related to its low cost, which in and of itself is good, but that low cost often drives over application of imidacloprid to turf grass. We typically see wall-to-wall applications because it's easy to do. There's really not as much scouting that we can do at this time. We can scout for adults, but there's really no larvae to go in and do decision-making about. So it's often over-applied, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting many of the applications we make are actually unnecessary. So it contributes to the problems that we could have with it. There are ways, though, while we still have this as an option, and using other systemic insecticides as well, that we can optimize their use for preventative white grub management. So the first is really focusing on the right reason, applying them for the right reason, not necessarily wall to wall because we can afford it, but really thinking about the site itself. Is the site one that has chronic grub pressure and chronic damage? Is there high aesthetic and performance requirements? Can this site not tolerate any negative aesthetic appearance to it? Or does it have a really high actual performance for athletics requirement like that? Those are traits that really can help you narrow down a site that may require a preventative application versus all sites you're managing. I'm using neighborhoods in this example just to highlight that you might have some hotspot sites that you can keep records of and use that type of information to make this decision. Right time is also really important. As I mentioned on the previous side, trying to synchronize these introductions of the products with peak adult activity. Peak adult flight and egg laying is really important. You can monitor this through a number of ways, and I don't mean pheromone and floral lure traps here. I mean things like just monitoring natural populations. So this is an example of monitoring European chafer activity. This dawn and dusk, you'll see swarms of adults mating over shrub lines, small street trees, things like that. It's really helpful in sort of picking up on when that flush of peak activity is to time those preventative applications. Next is right location, and this comes back around here. So really areas with chronic grub pressure, chronic populations, keeping records of which sites have that can be really useful later on, especially because you don't have larvae to scout. You can use the historical presence of those problems to help flag properties or sites on a course or areas of turf that likely need a preventative application. And then lastly, right product. So right product, this is going to get into some other slides where we'll talk about alternatives, but whether it's imidacloprid or one of the alternatives that's out there, the biggest one we have is chlorantionilprole. So this is an anthranilic diamide. We'll talk about some of the trade-offs that come with it, but this is, in many cases, a pretty viable alternative that we have. There's one exception to that I think we need to point out, and that is that on Long Island, it's only available for golf courses. And for a while, it wasn't even available to golf courses, but there's actually a special local needs regulation right now that allows its use on golf courses. But once we lose imidacloprid, it's on Long Island, it's only golf courses that will have access to chlorantionilprole. The rest of the folks managing under license on Long Island will not have a preventative product that they can use with the current list that we have registered for the state. So that's a really important point. And that leads us to our second poll. So Hillary, if you want to fire that one up. And this is another true or false scenario. And it states that on Long Island, New York, chlorantionilprole is available for use by lawn care professionals as long as they're licensed as a New York applicator under category 3A. True or false?
Okay, and I'll say the same thing again. If you're here for credits, please make sure that you are answering these questions. You'll have to answer all three in order to get the credit, be it ISA or DEC. So please make sure that you are here for the duration and answer all the questions. We got about 60% of everyone here has answered. We're definitely a little torn on this one, a little bit more than the last one. We'll give it a little bit longer. About 70%. We'll give it another maybe 15 seconds. And if you're having problems with it, feel free to put it in the chat if you can't get it to work on your screen. All right, so it looks like there now is a clear winner from everyone. So I will stop it and share the results.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Yeah, so false is the answer. So there, again, this is somewhat of a trick question, not completely a trick question, but so lawn care professionals, even if you are fully licensed, chlorantraniliprole is not available. So it's really just Gulf turf where it's available for use. So that's going to be an important change once we actually lose imidacloprid as an option down there. Okay, let's keep rolling. So we'll stick with white grubs for a little while because there's some more I want to share about that. And that is that, especially in scenarios where you may not have access to a preventative systemic insecticide, once imidacloprid is off the table for turf grass, we need to think about other options. And that is widens the conversation out to not just preventative applications, but also curative management approaches for white grub control. So rather than thinking about a window of time here where products are applied at peak adult activity, we now are thinking later in the season when we have larvae active, first, second, and third stage of white grub larvae actively feeding on the turf and damaging the turf. So it's different in that it's a little bit later. There might be damage showing up now. Things are seem a little bit more stressful because you've got all these the damage showing up at the same time the larvae are, but you also have the power of scouting in this window. So it gives you a lot more power for IPM practices to come into play. So we'll talk about those as we go here. Options for curative approaches, you can see that the list is fairly long. It's longer than we had for the preventative approaches that contain basically 2 products. And as I mentioned before, scouting is key for this. We're trying to target the larvae as young as we can because they're more susceptible to these products than when they mature. That's typically the case for any of these products. But it's interesting, if you start looking over this list, we have products like organophosphates, one active ingredient for that, carbamates, and pyrethroids. These are many of the products that we have been trying to replace or reduce the reliance on through introducing neonicotinoids. So they're starting to rear back around and show up on these lists again when we no longer have imidacloprid in the mix. So this is something we think about as we're decision making around this. So, but they're not the only products that are on the list. We also have insect growth regulators like azadirachtin. We have entomopathogenic nematodes. There's a couple species commercially available now that have shown decent results for white grub suppression. And also products like BT. We have a strain of BT called BT galeriae, Bacillus thuringiensis strain galeriae, that can be effective against white grubs for their management. Now, there's a lot of evidence showing that biologicals work really well in some cases and work not so well in others. This is an area that we're trying to work in now to find out ways that we can make them perform more consistently in all cases. But you can see that this list covers a wide range of insecticide types, which is a good thing. But there are some trade-offs. So it is fairly risky, as I mentioned. Here we're later in the season. It coincides with damage. Also, there's not a lot of wiggle room for making a rescue application after this. So if you weren't able to make an earlier one, everything's kind of invested in this window. So it's a little riskier. Also, as you saw on the previous slide, there's some conventional pesticides with higher environmental costs. But on the flip side of that, the fact that we have larvae gives us more power to scout and more power to make decisions. So we might be able to turn that into smaller treatment areas if we can identify small hotspots of grubs and grub damage. And we can also tailor our treatments, maybe even decide that we don't have to treat it all based on the densities that we see and whether or not damage is showing up. So this gives us a lot of power to take even what could be the use of a more impactful pesticide, environmentally costly pesticide, but use it on a smaller scale and sort of balance that scale out from effects and beneficials and effectiveness against pests. It also opens the door, as I said, to using biological control. So some trade-offs to consider for sure when looking at curative management. Okay, I'm going to stop nerding out on white grubs and we're going to move into the next group. We're still going to kind of stay below ground with these groups. So these are European and common crane flies. We have two species in this group, Tipula pallidosa and Tipula oleracea. So they differ in a number of ways, but the biggest way that they differ that's important for the manager is that Tipula pallidosa has a 1 generation life cycle and per year, and oleracea has 2 generations per year. So I think I have a life cycle slide on the next one to show you. Like white grubs, they feed primarily on roots, but they'll also come up and feed on crowns, stems, and blades. And the damage from from European and common crane fly typically shows up early in spring, earlier than most managers are ready to jump in and do something about. So it can be challenging. It doesn't sync up with damage and management of other pests as easily. Another challenge we have with these crane flies is that we have a lot of species of native crane fly in New York. Their larvae don't really inhabit turf soils, but we see their adults bumbling around in grasses and hanging out on buildings, and they just kind of complicate the decision-making process. So learning how to distinguish them is important. So their management under imidacloprid, or our primary neonicotinoid, we have preventative and curative approaches. So here's the life cycle of the two, Tipula pallidosa with just 1 generation a year, and oleracea with 2. And we'll talk about how management syncs up for the 2 of them, or how it plays out for the 2 of them. So with preventative applications, we have for pallidosa, we have 1 window of opportunity. Again, we're trying to sync these up, introduce these products with peak adult activity. It's pretty easy to tell when that is for crane flies because they're very large and clumsy. And fortunately, where crane flies are, they tend to target wet areas or poorly drained areas. And that typically predicts where the larvae are going to be, unlike with white grubs. So that is one convenient thing about them, but really trying to get those preventative applications out at peak activity points. For both species, there's an activity window of adults in late summer to fall. And for Tipula oleracea, there's a second one because they have 2 generations a year, a second one that occurs here in April or May. So 2 windows of time for oleracea for those preventative applications of imidacloprid. Curative applications look a little different. For both species in spring, we have larvae present, and those larvae can be intercepted with a curative application of imidacloprid, as well as for Tipula oleracea, a larval application in summer. It's the same exact time windows for other products, but let's take a look at non-neonicotinoid options for crane flies. So when it comes to preventative options, we really have that one option again, chlorangeniliprole. And again, this depends on where you are. If you're managing lawns on Long Island, this is not an option for you, but for everyone else, folks in Gulf and everyone else in New York outside of Long Island, it is an option for preventative management. Curative options, it's a little bit longer list, but it is the primary 3 that we've talked about, neonicotinoids, attempting to diminish the use of or replace. We have organophosphates, carbamates, and pyrethroids coming back around again as really the main options we have out there for curative control of crane flies. So that's something to take into account moving forward. Okay, let's leave the soil for a bit and we'll talk about critters that are active at the soil surface. And for this, we'll focus on hairy chinch bug. So chinch bugs are widespread in New York. They can have 1 to 2 generations a year, depending on where in New York you are. Common in home lawn turf. They really like thatchy turf because thatch gives them a nice habitat to survive in, and they're active right at that interface between thatch and soil. So very unlike other pests where we're digging in soil to find them, they're right at the surface. So they're a true insect. They have a piercing, sucking mouthpart, and they pierce and suck the fluids out of the crown and the stem of turf. This is what their damage looks like along this driveway. This is right here in Geneva. I can almost see it from my office. And damage sort of spreads out from these areas. It sort of initially started as this very small patch by the driveway and then spread out from there. The active population is right in this green band around the damaged section. So that's really where the chinch bugs are and are feeding. And this tends to start in late spring and span through summer and into early fall. So just to go over the life cycle, because it'll help understand the management a little bit. Typically, upstate New York, northern New England, and Canada, where we have problems with them as well, we have one generation a year. So right now, unlike things like white grubs, chinch bugs are spending the winter as adults. So they go into to overwinter in the adult phase. So right now, that's where they are. They're all hunkered down. They don't really have the harshest winter right now to survive, but that's what they're doing. Come spring, they'll exit that. This typically is late April to May, and they will begin to lay eggs in the turf. So this is May through usually June that we see eggs show up, but it can be later if you have more generations per year downstate, for example. From there, we see the emergence of nymphs. There's 5 different nymph stages that will develop through, and this is typically when we start to see damage appear in the turf in this window here. Then we have adults from that generation, and those are the population that will then go into overwinter. So that's the full life cycle. Okay, neonicotinoid used for hairy chinch bug. Neonics, imidacloprid does have hairy chinch bug on the label, and it is applied as a preventative prior to egg hatch. And that is in this window here, when adults are coming out of overwintering and are starting to spread out in the turf, that's the time when neonicotinoids are recommended to be used against hairy chinch bug. It really is a suppressive action only. It's not something that will wipe out the population. But again, the goal is to have it into the system before these adults lay eggs or before those eggs hatch. It does have to be watered in, but really just to the soil surface. Okay, so that's how neonicotinoids are used for hairy chinch bug. What about a scenario without neonics? How does that look? We get a fairly long list of products. Again, we see organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids on the list for that, but there's a number of other insecticides and other non-chemical options available as well. Insect growth regulators like azadirachtin, chlorantroniloprol, again, is an option registered for hairy chinch bug management. We do have a couple biological practices on here. One is kind of out of our control, except for some non-target effects we can have on it, and that's the conservation of big-eyed bug. So this is big-eyed bug right here. It looks very much like chinch bug, except it has big eyes and a wide head. There's some other features that we show folks in our turf insect workshop, but here you can just kind of look generally at it. And oftentimes, if you look very late in chinch bug infestation and you see insects, you're seeing a mixture of chinch bug and big-eyed bug because it's come in to feed on chinch bugs. So we can really reduce negative non-target effects on chinch bug or on big-eyed bug through proper insecticide selection. But in addition to that, we do have commercially available biocontrols like Bavaria bassiana. There's some good evidence that it can control nymphs of hairy chinch bug. I'll also mention some cultural practices because you might see them in some of the extension literature out there. There's some suggestion to shift to endophytic varieties of turfgrass, and that can be quite successful. The one barrier to that is getting endophytically infected turfgrass consistently. That's something that isn't always as consistent as we need it to be, but you'll see that mentioned in some of the literature. And also thatch management. So I mentioned chinch bugs really like thatchy turf. So managing thatch properly can help to make it a less suitable habitat for chinch bug. Okay, I'm going to move in now into sort of a Gulf specific pest, and we'll talk about annual bluegrass weevil. So annual bluegrass weevil is primarily a Gulf pest because it really likes short mown turf. So you can see one of the challenges in its management is its size. It's quite small and can be very, very cryptic. So like hairy chinch bug, annual bluegrass weevil spends the winter in these protected areas as an adult. They'll move into natural areas on golf courses, longer grass areas, areas with leaf litter, and things like that. And again, it's the same idea. It provides a buffering habitat for them to survive harsh winter conditions better. So from one cryptic habitat, they move into another. They walk out in spring towards short mown areas of the turf. They'll chew notches in the plant and deposit eggs in the stem and leaf sheath. And from there, those eggs hatch and the larvae feed inside the stem. So for the first few larval stages of annual bluegrass weevil larvae, they're hidden inside the stem. And again, hard to find. So cryptic in the forest, then cryptic within the plant itself. If that's not enough being cryptic, when they reach their 4th instar, they pop out into the soil, and now they're a soil insect. So there's like all these ways that they're hard to find, and that complicates their management for sure. So where imidacloprid comes in is a bit of a longer story. So I'll be as concise as I can, but the majority of annual bluegrass weevil management historically is focused on managing adults. And the idea has been to try and intercept them as they come out of these overwintering sites. So they're in these it might not be a forest, but they're in these protected areas with leaf litter, or they're hunkered down for winter, and then they start to move towards the short mown native playing surfaces of the golf courses, and intercepting them before that happens and before they lay eggs would be a good thing. So that has been primarily the goal, and that has not been done necessarily with neonicotinoids. It's primarily done with pyrethroids, but also organophosphates in that mix as well. It's really hard to time that right. There has been some really good work bringing about phenological indicators and degree days to try and predict peak activity of adults to make those applications count. But often we get poor control, poorly timed applications, and it's led to the development of insecticide resistance in a number of cases. So because of that, there's been a broadening of the options and approaches to managing annual bluegrass weevil to also include managing larvae. And this is where imidacloprid comes at all on the radar for annual bluegrass weevil management. So there are a couple different stages. The one that I mentioned first is in the stem of the plant when the larvae are young, and then later on they pop out into the soil. So there is a preventative approach where imidacloprid can play a role, and that tends to be, again, timed with the peak adult activity for introducing the product. So it's in the plant by the time these eggs hatch and the larvae start to feed inside the stem. The primary product for that has been chlorantraniliprole, sort of the alternative that we're talking about to imidacloprid. But in cases where at one point chlorantraniliprole was not available, imidacloprid was used by golf course superintendents. I don't think it's relied on very heavily in general. So in this case, its removal, I don't think is going to cause too big of a stir. There's also a window later on for these more mature larvae, which is a curative approach to their management. And you can see a number of products on this list as well, or a number of active ingredients, I should say, including one of our organophosphates, but also another anthranilic diamide, cyantraniloprole, spinosad, and indoxacarb. So there's a number of options. The challenge to managing annual bluegrass weevil has not completely gone away. It's quite complicated, but removal of imidacloprid, I don't think is really going to rock the world of annual bluegrass weevil management. So, all right, let's stick within the weevils for a little bit and talk about billbug, but we're moving away from short mown golf turf into taller mown turf now, and that's the bluegrass billbug. So tends to be more problematic in situations like home lawns, roughs. I've seen athletic fields with billbug problems. So taller mown turf, a variety of turf grass types. They, unlike things like annual bluegrass weevil, have just one life cycle or one generation per year. Right now, they're as adults overwintering in the same kind of scenario, except they also like pavement, things like that. They'll bunker up against houses, against and underneath pavement, and then they move out from there in spring towards the turf. So that kind of shapes the way the damage appears, just like that picture I showed of hairy chinch bug. Damage often shows up and occurs along those paved edges. So, and people often think it's salt injury from the previous winter snow management. You can see the general life cycle here, and we'll talk about its how that syncs up with its management this slide. So imidacloprid is available for billbug management. And like all preventative approaches, it's timed with peak adult activity before egg laying to try and intercept that window. The goal being to get it there before eggs hatch and before you have first instar billbug larvae feeding. That tends to occur around 60 degrees May into June. Looking at alternatives to imidacloprid, there's again quite a long list. It does again include the organophosphates, carbamates, and pyrethroids, but we also see two different diamides, chlorantraniliprole and cyantraniloprole available. That's a mouthful. And some combined products as well. So pyrethroid, carbamate combinations have a billbug on the label as well for this window, again, intercepting adults before they lay eggs. Larval management later on in spring and summer, there's again a range of products. Carbamates are on that list, but so are both of our diamides. So it's a bit shorter list, but there still are products available in that window. Okay, let's move on to talk about ants a little bit. So ants are a unique one because they're really not feeding directly on the turf. They're not something that's munching on roots or shoots or anything like that. It's really through their mounding that they cause problems. And it's really more problematic on short mown turf because that mounding comes up further into the turf system and can actually extend above it. It can be a nightmare for turf grass managers, especially working in the shop that have to sharpen reel mower blades and things like that. And it can make a real mess of the putting greens as well. So it can be problematic for primarily that reason through mounding. They prefer well-drained sandy soils, and they can be common in all turfgrass types. So damage typically shows up in spring once new queens that have established the previous fall start to establish and build out the mound. And then there's mating flights that occur in summer where we start to see those new nodes of mounds show up. So imidacloprid used for ant management, again, it does show up, ants do show up on the label for many imidacloprid products in a few different forms. We see it as mound drenches, we see it in granular form, and we see it applied as a perimeter spray. And in all cases, it's really just for suppression. It's hard to control ants with anything completely, but we also see it as a suppression for not directly ants, but to indirectly control ants through controlling insects that ants tend on plants. So ants tend a number of insects that produce a sugary substance called honeydew. They're sort of an exchange. The insect, whether it's an aphid, a scale insect, or a mealybug, produces the sweet honeydew as a provision for the ant in exchange for protection. And the ants defend these insects from a whole range of predatory insects. It's a very interesting interaction as an entomologist, but it's a very problematic one for a manager. So in a number of ornamentals, this can be problematic. And the management step is actually to control that sugar producing insect to then also control the ant. Okay, neonicotinoid alternatives for ants. There's a long list. And again, these same ones are on there. Organophosphates, carbamates, and pyrethroids are rearing their heads again. But we also see a range of other products. Avamectin and hydromethylanon. These are really common in ant baits, especially in home ant baits, granular baits, like Amdro, one of the ones you hear about the most down in fire ant country, hydromethylanon. So other products are out there labeled for ants. Indoxacarb is one, spinosad is another, and in really specialized cases that wouldn't be as suitable for really broad scale use, there's things like CO2 mound injection. Okay. So for the last two, we're going to move into moth and caterpillar pests, and we'll start with black cutworm. Here we're again moving into short-mown turf. It's more of a problem in short-mown turf than tall. This is our first pest that really doesn't overwinter at all in New York. So we really get black cutworm through spring storm fronts that move them up from the south. And that's, we monitor in traps to see when they arrive. It's a pest that people monitor for in other crops as well. So that's how they arrive here. They're not overwintering. Once they're here, though, they can have 2 to 3 generations that can be quite problematic. So they oviposit or lay their eggs on the blades of the grass, turf grass. You can see a picture of that here. And this is actually a decent management practice where folks will try to go out early and mow off the tips of the grass to remove those eggs. So it's a good cultural practice for removing them. Larvae, this is a picture of the larva here. It's a pretty easy to identify larva. They have kind of an oily appearance, a real dark look to them, and they curl up into a coil. And during the day, they hide out in these little burrows that they make in thatch. You can see some of this little neon green color in here is their frass. So they hide out in these protective areas, and then they emerge from that at night to feed. So they're really feeding at night. It can be easy to overlook until you see their damage. The damage looks like pock marks on greens, almost like ball marks that when the ball hits the green. It shows up in late spring, and because there's up to 3 generations, can span through summer. So interestingly, there really aren't. So I talked about what neonics are available in turf grass. So imidacloprid really. So these other neonicotinoids actually have cutworm on the label, black cutworm specifically, but it's for their management in other crops. Thiamethoxam, tefrin, and clothianidin all have black cutworm on the labels, but none of these are available for turf grass. So really there's not an imidacloprid product that we see commonly used for cutworm management in turf. There's a range of other products though that aren't used. Our big 3 again, organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids, but you can see indoxacarb is again on the list. Indoxacarb is a big one that primarily was meant to target lepidopterans like cutworm. Our diamides are back on the list again, both chlorantraniliprole and cyantraniliprole, spinosad, and also there's evidence suggesting that one of the more surface active entomopathogenic or insect pathogenic nematodes, Steinernema carpocapsae, can be effective in their control as well. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is sod webworm, and we're moving away from short-mown turf into taller-mown turf. There's a lot of species of sod webworm. This is really not a species. This is like a complex of species. We have nearly 100 of them in North America, which complicates their management for sure. This is generally what sod webworm looks like. It has this, we call them snout moths, and you can see this little bottle brush look to the front of their head. So They can have 1 to 3 generations per year, but that really depends on the species. It varies by species. They also use dead organic matter to protect themselves, and they actually overwinter in it as a larva or pupa. And they use this thing that they create called the hibernacula to protect them against that, to really buffer them against winter conditions. So this is a picture of the hibernacula here. They can be common in a range of tall mown turf, lawns, roughs, fairways that are mown tall, and have a pretty broad feeding range, including outside of turf, because they can be a pest in other crops as well. The damage window typically is July to August for them. Unlike cutworm, there are products that we see imidacloprid with sodworm on the label for. It tends to be combination products, though, imidacloprid combined with pyrethroids or imidacloprid combined with organophosphates. And we see it recommended as use for preventative management as well as curative management, either timing it with peak adult activity or the presence of larvae above thresholds. So there's a lot of alternatives like we've talked about before. It's really the same list that we saw on the previous slide. We do see a couple additional products creep on there, some horticultural oils, neem oil, mineral oil around there as well. I can't speak to their efficacy, but you do see them mentioned a lot in the extension literature around sodworm management. Okay, so a lot of what we've been talking about really speaks to finding a balance, trying to find ways to minimize impacts. If we're moving forward without neonicotinoids, how do we do that where we can select efficacious products and do so in a way that's not going to erode the beneficial soil food webs we are trying to preserve and ecological services that turf grasses can provide. And so turf grasses can provide a lot of beneficial ecosystem services. So it really pays for us to think about trying to achieve that balance. So I want to talk about this sort of the way forward that we have, a neonic-free way forward that we're going to be forced to follow, and how it sort of impacts both sides of this balance to kind of round out the talk today. So the first is the way forward with preventative products. And let's talk specifically about chlorantioniliprole, because this is already an important tool for us, and it's going to be one that we are going to have to rely on more for preventative management. So we'll focus on beneficials first. So far, what we've seen in the literature and some of the work that my lab is doing is that there appears to be more minimal impacts on beneficial soil organisms, which is great to see. There's also relatively fewer impacts on pollinators. There are some variable responses suggesting maybe there could be some impacts in caterpillars like monarchs, but there's still a lot of data to generate on this to really understand and compare the two. Like neonicotinoids, they are water soluble and persistent. This is one of the main reasons that their registration for Long Island has been so problematic, because the water table is right under the surface of the soil in Long Island. So that is something that proves challenging and can relate to other things like impact on groundwater and surface water. And similar also to neonicotinoids, they have low mammalian toxicity, also a thumbs up, a good thing. So, but let's talk about their sort of the way forward in terms of their use against pests. The first is that fortunately they've shown to be pretty effective against white grubs and other turfgrass insects. So it does appear like it's going to be and already is a good alternative preventative for us to use, but it is costly. So at present, it costs anywhere from 3 to 10 times more than imidacloprid. And I've seen a lot of people asking whether or not there's going to be generic products available for chlorantioniliprole. Right now, there's really one provider, but this is a big question on everybody's mind, I know. So see what that brings. And this issue with Long Island, I've mentioned this a couple times now, but really, when we do lose neonicotinoids, this product is only going to be an option on Long Island if you are working in Gulf. If you're outside of that, it's currently not one. So that's something that we're going to have to confront in our management decisions. And that brings up the next slide, talking about the way forward, which is around curative strategies. As you've seen on the last dozen or so slides, there's a much longer list of active ingredients when it comes to curative strategies for managing turf pests, but they contain some of the ones that we've been trying to avoid through using neonics, like organophosphates and carbamates. So let's talk about the beneficial and pest balance with this type of approach. So as I just mentioned, we are bringing back older chemistries when we start to use often these curative strategies. Many of them are broad spectrum. Many of them have quite high mammalian toxicity and highly toxic to pollinators, so quite problematic. It is a window, though, where biological and bio-based products become an option for us, and many of the products within this category have shown very low non-target effects. So there's some good and bad and some trade-offs in this category related to their non-target impacts on beneficials. On the flip side, let's talk about pests. Again, shifting back to older chemistries that we used very heavily before we had neonicotinoids to rely on. They're quite effective, but they bring increased trade-offs along with it. So this increases our focus on IPM, the need to use IPM to try and minimize those impacts. One thing I mentioned, a good thing about managing things curatively is that we have larvae present. We can scout, we can do proper decision-making and pest ID. And that, even though you might be using a more environmentally impactful product, you might be able to shrink the application footprint down to a much smaller area. So leaving the majority of that property untreated. So that's one way that we can sort of help achieve this balance better, even through using some of these older chemistries. And this is going to be, as I mentioned, especially important on Long Island, where you might not have that curative or preventative alternative like chlorantraniliprole to lean on when you lose imidacloprid. Also, we need to deal with the variable effectiveness of biological control. So there's, as I mentioned, a number of products that can perform really, really well. And then in the next experiment we do, they don't perform well at all. So trying to figure out what's driving that and how can we improve that consistency so people can rely on them more as an option and increase their adoption. Because I think they have a lot of promise for turf pest management in soil. Okay, so just to summarize where I'm seeing the gaps now, and then I'll ask you all where you're seeing the gaps and the need. I think one of the big ones is that we need to improve options for preventative pest management, especially preventative products on Long Island, since there's going to be few cases where we have alternatives for preventative management. I am often asked, so it's available for Gulf on Long Island, anthraquinone diamides. Is there going to be a point where it's broadened, the registration is broadened so that anthraquinone diamides like chlorantraniliprole can be used by other sectors of turf on Long Island? I don't know. I know it's a very lengthy process involving well water and groundwater management and monitoring, but it's something that I know is of concern, and I know there's interest in it. It's going to be a conversation that will have to be had for sure. Looking at novel products, I'm not even sure it's a question about novel products. There's actually quite a few other products, especially anthraquinone diamides, available out there outside of New York. Many of them are just not labeled in New York State, though. So tetraniliprole is an example of that has shown really good effectiveness across a range of pests used as a systemic, but it's currently not available in New York. I also think we need to come up with more sustainable curative options. So this is especially going to be the case for pests like crane fly, where on Long Island, it's really just those older chemistries we have to lean on if we can't use a preventative product. So we need better and more effective curative options for a number of pests. Increasing reliance on IPM when using older chemistries. We teach this a lot in some of our workshops, how to do proper decision-making, identification, and diagnosis, but I think we really need to ramp this up in our education and research to help people use some of these curative products that exist already more sustainably, and also improving reliability and consistency of biological and bio-based products, as I mentioned in the last slide, I think is another key that we need to dig into. Okay, so here's our last question. We just got a few minutes left here. I'm curious what your biggest concerns and needs are regarding the loss of neonicotinoids for turf. We have some options you can choose, and I think Hillary's including an other category, so you can write it into the chat window. So I also, if you look up here, I've got a QR code. You can scan this with your phone or check into it later. I have a poll set up outside of this. And so if you're thinking about it and you come up with other ideas later on, please do follow that and come tell us what some of your biggest concerns are and what some of the research gaps and needs are that you feel are most important for us to be addressing. We're thinking about it a lot, but it's always good to get everyone else's feedback on this. So.
All right. So if everyone's going, and I will say it one final time. If you are here for credit, please make sure you're answering this question. And as Kyle said, if you have another reason that you have a concern about it, feel free to click on other and write it into the chat. We're about 62%. So we'll give it maybe another 15 seconds for everyone who needs those credits to get their answer in. Okay. Wow, we have and even first place.
Mhm.
Let's see. I think
Yeah, there's no real perfect right answer on this. It's really what's going to impact you all the most. So it looks like price is a big one. We kind of expected this. And I think that relates to the questions that I get often about whether or not there will be a broadening of the market for chlorantraniliprole based products. So
someone in the chat said not really about turf grass, but concerns about options for treating trees for insect pests as well.
yeah. Yeah,
And
I mean, I can speak broadly to the use. I know it's commonly used, especially for injections for trees. I'm not as familiar with the alternative options we have out there for trees though. So wish I could speak to that well also.
we also have toxicity of these products and IPM for growth control. Um, it might not be realistic for, if someone has 1,200 homes with only 3 to 6 workers, um,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yep. Yeah, that's an important one. So we talk frequently about how to most effectively scout properties, but knowing full well that if you're managing a lot of properties, that's difficult to do for sure. I think that is where, if you have preventative options available to you, using them as diligently as you can through decision making. Are they products that you have historical record of? These are the ones that always have problems. These are the ones that tend to have hotspots of white grubs. That's a good decision making tool. But I fully understand that there's the risk aspect to it as well. So that is a major challenge that we're going to face. And if you are on Long Island too, I acknowledge that you might not even have that curative or that preventative option. So I
This
do think there's some ways to break down scouting to help that make that as simple as possible. But again, it changes your time frame as a manager for sure. I understand that.
this is a pretty interesting one too. The concern for how long it will be for better and newer options to arrive.
Yeah. So our goal with this first project is to have in our report evaluation of those options in 2026. So, and there's another question that just came up I want to touch on related to the timing, but yeah, so that is the point we're hoping to present some of that. I think, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily even novel products. A lot of this relates to products that are out there, just not necessarily available for parts of the state or all of the state. So I think in addition to some of that research, there's some work that needs to be done on where we can make some progress in getting products registered and evaluated for the potential to be used in New York, other diamides, for example. So it's new products and bringing in products that already exist to the state. There was one question. Oh, okay,
Well,
sorry.
I'll just say real fast that everyone who is here, thank you for coming. And Kyle, thank you very much for coming to talk to us about it. If you're here for credits, please make sure you log out before you leave. But let's go and answer the questions in the Q&A while we have some time. Well, extra time, but let's see what we have in that Q&A.
Yeah, so Keith said his copy of the Birds and Bees Act states imidacloprid use ends December 31st, 2026. The most recent update I have from our Dean of Government Affairs said December 31st, 2026. I'll double check on that, but I do know that there was a time when the date was earlier. My understanding of it is that it was moved later, but I will double check on that. So that's a good question.
And then
Yeah, so Keith says it reads end of July 1st, 2025. I did see that language in an earlier email that I got about this as well. I do think it's December 2026, but we'll check. We know do we know neonicotinoids impacts on soil microbial life? This was from an anonymous attendee. So we do know. I had some data on that I had to move because I didn't think I was going to have time to show it. And I realized I didn't. But so we've done some work on neonics in soil, especially on microbial mycorrhizal fungi and mycorrhizal infection in turf grass. And we find that even 2 months after an application of imidacloprid, it suppresses the infection roots by mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae are super important for turf because they help improve stress tolerance of turf grass and they help turf grasses take up nutrients. They're sort of a symbiotic exchange with the plant. So it does affect soil microbial communities, their biomass, and especially those symbiotic microbes we rely on. And there's a lot of data around neonics and soil microbial communities out there. So it's a great question. So I got a question here. Isn't it just a matter of time before the broad spectrum older products are also banned? So we did see that one organophosphate, chlorpyrifos, was banned for use. We have that one additional organophosphate, trichlorphan. You probably see the label name Dilox on there. It's a very common one that is still available. But yes, many pesticides are under scrutiny. And I think that it really motivates us to not just look for pesticidal solutions, but also for non-pesticide based practices. That's something that's a much harder lift to get consistent practices that are effective, but it's something that we're well aware of we need to develop as well for turf grass. So it's a great question, a hard one to answer definitively though. So David smartly asks whether trichlorphan should be of concern as well for groundwater because it's fairly mobile in soil as well. And I think, yes, I think that especially if we start to shift reliance back towards organophosphates like trichlorphan, that might be something that we do encounter more problems with. It's going to be a pretty important tool in the toolbox when we don't have preventative application options anymore. So that'll be, I think, maybe one of our next big challenges, and relates maybe to the previous question I just read. So, yeah, shouldn't be laughing about that one, but I think that is going to be a real issue we confront. Question about whether or not there'll be emergency exemption for emerald ash borer with imidacloprid after 2026. So, as I mentioned, there is some language in this act about emergency exemptions. The only one that I know of is language around hemlock woolly adelgid. I'm not sure about emerald ash borer. It's a good question. Unfortunately, all the ash trees around me are completely dead, which is very unfortunate. But I understand the urgency to preserving the ash trees that we still have. So I don't actually know. It's a good question. I didn't see any language around exemptions for that, but it is a good question.